By the end of the war, I think the Americans had supplied over 400,000 Studebaker trucks, for instance, to the Soviets. That makes all your armies motorized. I mean, the Red Army was a motorized army thanks to American mass-produced engineering, which doesn't really get discussed in Russia much nowadays. It can't be denied. It's not just the SS. You can't commit that many atrocities on a vast military army that you're up against, but equally a vast civilian population. You can't do that just with the SS and kill millions upon millions of Soviet citizens and Soviet soldiers. That's got to be with the complete combined strength of whatever armies you have at your disposal. And the vast bulk of German forces on the Eastern Front were Wehrmacht.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. I'm your host, Oliver Webb-Carter. Now today we're dealing with the Eastern Front during World War II and the brutality there, as you heard from my guest Iain MacGregor at the top. This episode is dealing with the fighting after Stalingrad, and so makes up rather a nice trilogy on the pod. So the first part, that's the Nazi-Soviet pact with Roger Morehouse. And then Iain, today's guest, talks us through Stalingrad in a previous episode too. And now the trilogy is completed with the fighting on the Eastern Front. Perhaps we'll do the advance onto Berlin too and make it a quadrilogy. Anyway, Iain's book is out now in paperback, so listeners, there is a message you need to listen to. There is an Easter egg in this podcast, but you have to listen and you'll get a nice surprise. This message from Iain and myself goes out to all of you from wherever you're listening, be it Montreal or Manchester, Lima or London, Buenos Aires or Bognor Regis. Coming up, I've got the film club on Tuesday, Bloody Sunday, Paul Greengrass's film of that terrible event. Then I have Serhii Plokhy on Ukraine, Peter Taylor on the Troubles, and much, much more. But until then, here's me talking to Iain MacGregor on the Eastern Front. Iain MacGregor, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me. We're here to celebrate your paperback version of The Lighthouse of Stalingrad. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
And so you came on just before Christmas, and this was a very popular podcast of yours. There's something about Stalingrad that always attracts people, isn't it? Isn't there?
Yeah. Well, I think I was researching and writing the book way before events unfolded in Ukraine. So, yeah, that keeps, I suppose, that whole area and Russia, I suppose, front and center of everyone's minds. Well, I haven't found any, I thought I might do, because obviously when you're an author and you've produced a book like this, and then events overtake you and you think, you could argue selfishly, I suppose, bugger me, what's gonna happen? Now I've written a book that extols the virtues of the Red Army, and here they are steamrolling or trying to steamroller their way into a sovereign country next door to them. But as you said, I think a lot of people, which has been good because that's the way I look at it as well, you have to kind of park your present day prejudices or opinions, and I have lots of them. I talk about them in my talks about how bad the Russian bear is at the moment, but I think you have to park that and then think, well, then just look at it through the prism of World War II. And it is, in terms of combatants and casualties and destruction, the biggest battle or campaign, I suppose, of World War II. And so why wouldn't it be interesting?
Yeah, absolutely. And we spoke about the battle itself last time, and I guess it's this sort of pivotal moment because we're going to talk about the aftermath and basically in the Eastern Front post Stalingrad. And I just, like you were just talking about how you've written this book about the mighty Russian bear against the Germans, the Nazis at Stalingrad. And obviously we've had the invasion of Ukraine, like you've mentioned. Have you had any sort of difficult questions in any of your talks from people who are sort of might say, oh, well, the Russians, the Russian army is repeating what it's been doing for centuries, as it did in the Eastern Front and earlier in the Ukraine. And so,
well, generally no, because I'm at pains when I do my presentations and talk, well, presentations at literary festivals, and then I do a lot of talks to schools and colleges. I mean, I primarily do that actually, because I find them really worthwhile, and I hope the students do too. But I've got a good PowerPoint, and I've got lots of photographic evidence and maps and everything else. But what I'm at pains to talk to them about really is, and I just made the mistake right at the beginning, is call it the Russian army, and it's obviously the Soviet Red Army, which is comprised, there's millions and millions of men and women served and fought and died in it, and they all came from the 15 Soviet republics that were there at the time. And what's the irony, because of what's happening right now, is the biggest ethnic group outside of Russians that served in the Red Army were Ukrainians. So millions of Ukrainians served, fought and died, wounded, whatever, in the Red Army. I mean, a great many of them fought on the Axis side as well.
Yeah, what were the numbers of on both sides, roughly?
Well, that's a good question. It's well over 4 to 5 million served in the Red Army or served in partisan forces fighting behind the German front line. And of that, the Ukrainians who did fight in the Red Army suffered more casualties in terms of dead and wounded than the forces of Britain, France, and the USA combined. So that's well over 1 million dead. And so that's obviously something massive, you've got to take that into context. But yeah, on the other side, well over 1 million fought for the Germans. But like I said, they were, I would argue, potentially it was obviously an anti-Soviet, anti-communist element that fought there and served in the various, concentration camp archipelago that the Germans have set up. You get a lot of Ukrainian guards working there as well. So that, yeah, you could argue there was a split, but the dominant feature is that Ukrainians fought for the Red Army and suffered enormous casualties. And the bulk of the fighting is, there's a great deal of it on Russian soil, but there's a great deal of it across the whole of Ukraine and Belarus as well. So that's where the real, as it's been called before, the bloodlands of the Eastern Front, that's where it is really. And this incursion down into southern Russia, which culminated at Stalingrad, that was the big attack into southern Russia. But the bulk of the fighting would be done before and after in the lands spanning across the Donbass of the Ukraine and Belarus.
So, right, well, we Stalingrad is over. The Germans have had to surrender. And so when that happened, what was the impact on the German army? Was it then inevitable that the various army groups would be going into reverse?
Well, they fought hard for weeks and months after the Sixth Army was surrounded at Stalingrad, and the focus of, I suppose, the German High Command and Adolf Hitler was they had to stabilize the line, because they haven't just got the Sixth Army, I was going to say entombed, but surrounded around not just the city itself, but obviously the Stalingrad front is hundreds of kilometers in circumference. That's why it's a front. That's why there's various Soviet armies surrounding the Sixth Army. So you've got over 300,000 men with all the material that they need trapped along this line. This pocket's increasingly shrinking as the weeks go on, which would culminate obviously in their surrender at the end of January 1943. But equally, you've still got a vast number of Axis troops, predominantly German, that had pushed at the same time they were pushing towards the Volga in the east. The whole point of the campaign, Case Blau, was to capture the Soviet oil fields in Maikop and Grozny down in the Caucasus. They were still down there. They'd been stymied. Their attack had been blunted. Hence, by August, September, that's when the main focus Hitler had, that he needed something from Case Blau, the summer offensive, to justify the expenditure in men and material. So it's all eyes turned to Stalingrad, and we're going to capture Stalin city. But you've still got hundreds of thousands of troops with all their support, logistics, the Luftwaffe, etc., down in the Caucasus, hundreds and hundreds of miles to the south of Stalingrad. the Soviets, obviously, it's in their interest to think, right, well, let's not just surround the Sixth Army at Stalingrad on the Stalingrad front. We need now to push even further westwards, retake these transportation hubs further west, like Rostov and Voronezh, that the Germans had taken at the beginning of the summer, because they are the gateways. They're the door that opens up the Caucasus. And Zhukov, Georgy Zhukov, who was commanding all forces in that area, knew that if they could not only trap the Sixth Army, but then push further westwards, capture those transportation hubs, it closes the door on those huge number of German troops, Axis troops, that are still down in the Caucasus. So they had to be extricated. And that leads to the argument that Hitler had. His grand strategy was not just one of, I suppose, obedience to his will, that they'd got so far east and captured pretty much all of Stalingrad and they weren't going to give it up. Yes, there was that argument, and he was stubborn enough to think we have to stay there because if we leave, we won't get back. He argued that point to his chief of staff, Zeitler. But he also knew that I've got to try and get this army that's survived out of the Caucasus. And to do that, I need to tie down as many Soviet forces at Stalingrad, keep fighting, keep pushing, draw in all their fresh troops, that if they're let loose, they might block my path to actually extricating my armies that are still down south. And he'd got his firefighter, von Manstein, Erich von Manstein. He was his I suppose, his Rommel of the Eastern Front. He was his favorite. He was the guy that promised he could deliver.
He's always mentioned as sorry to interrupt. He's always mentioned as this sort of the kind of him and Rommel and Guderian as sort of the top three German generals. How good was Manstein?
Oh, I think he was very, very good, but equally as you had to be, and more so I would argue, than someone like, say, Rommel. Manstein was a politician as well. He knew how to. He was ambitious, like you had to be to get ahead at the upper echelons of German high command. Yeah, but he was a talented commander. He was innovative. He really saw, like quite a few seasoned senior German commanders, how motorized formations could get you what you wanted, even though he was a product of the Great War. So yeah, he's like Guderian, he's like Rommel, but he was, I would argue, more so than Rommel in North Africa. He was a winner on the Eastern Front. So before Case Blau had started that summer, he'd already laid waste to the Crimea. He captured what was seen as a really tough nut to crack, the fort of the port of Sevastopol, which he captured with his 11th Army. So he would have been on the, as you're looking at the map, he was on the
I'm
left
looking at
flank.
One right now.
Yeah.
I recommend listeners do as well.
So it had been his job to subdue the Crimea, capture it, and so that eased the pressure on any kind of surprise attack that the German Army Group South might have on its right flank as it was heading down into the Caucasus. And he'd done that very well. So he was one of those kind of generals that told Hitler to a degree what he wanted to hear, but if he had to, and it was advantageous to him personally, as in furthering his career, he wasn't shy of obviously telling Hitler some home truths as well. So it was him that was given the job as, like I said, this firefighter that was told to get down to the Caucasus, assess the position, see what we can do to extricate the whole armies that we've got down there, whilst it's all obviously still the bit of fighting is going on in Stalingrad. He was given a promotion. He was now in. They created a whole new army group for him, Army Group Don. But his main job was to extricate German forces deep in the Caucasus, get them back up to the west and north of Stalingrad, where Sixth Army was doomed, just buying time through its own blood, and then stabilize the whole line. Because at this point, Hitler still believed, yes, that he might have lost the Sixth Army, but he was still believing that there's no way they were going to be catastrophically defeated on the Eastern Front, especially while he had an intact army in the south that Manstein was going to extricate and then solidify the line. And that's what they did.
They attempt to push out, though, don't they, as well? I mean, this in the summer of 43, so after Stalingrad, and that's where we get these huge tank battles.
Yeah. Well, again,
I'm probably skipping around, so
well, you are a
please.
bit. No, what I was going to say was it was the whole. You've got to remember that there's three key things to remember, and I'm saying this because it gets to your point that you've just asked. Is in the first year of 41, when you have Operation Barbarossa and Hitler's trying to capture Moscow, that whole operation was would have resulted if they'd won. Hitler then he wins the war on the east on his own terms. But now we've just had Stalingrad, where they've had a catastrophic defeat for the Sixth Army. Everyone sees that, and I agree with them. Hitler's going to lose the war, but it's a question now, really, of how badly will he lose the war, and can he actually try and draw some kind of, I suppose, strategic draw from what is now a catastrophe on the Eastern Front. Obviously, the Allies still aren't in Western Front, well, not on the continent, the European continent just yet. D-Day's still another year and a half away. But then, as you're talking about, the pivotal point is what's going to happen in the spring and summer of 1943, and what's Hitler going to do now? And that's where we end up with the greatest tank battle in history, the Battle of Kursk.
But do you mean just to pick up on what you were just saying there? If the Germans had decided to, I mean, it's such a huge front, but if they decided to set up more defensively, are you saying that there's a potential that some kind of agreement could have been met with the Soviets that they would?
Well, how long's a piece of string? I mean, it's just my opinion.
It's a what if,
sure
yes.
You'll have lots of listeners spluttering on their tea listening to this, and what is he talking about? It's just my opinion. Hitler was never going to agree to having a defensive war on the Eastern Front. He was in it to win it. It was all or nothing with him. But it still didn't mean he didn't have the common sense to think, I still need, he's aware of how many men he's losing along the whole front. He'd learned, he'd seen the losses they'd had the year before. He knows he needs fresh troops. He needs existing healthy troops so that he can escape from the Caucasus to fight his war with whatever equipment they can save. He needs time to rebuild his forces. But yeah, one could argue that he always had in the back of his mind, probably driving a lot of his decision making, was this racial opinion of the enemy he had in front of him. He always assumed that the Soviets were inferior in every sense of the word, even though he had a lot of his senior commanders saying, look at the equipment they're producing. This tank we've encountered, the T-34, if they mass produce that could win the war for them. They're outproducing us in every facet in terms of planes, tanks, artillery equipment. And even though he's being shown all these statistics from his intelligence chiefs, from his chief of staff, Seitzler, he refuses to believe it. He just can't believe that they would be able to do this. And that plays itself out on the battlefield too. He just didn't believe that they had the nous, the ability, the sheer numbers of men after the losses that they had over the last 2 years of war, that they would be able to still hammer away, outthink, outfight the German army. He just didn't see it coming. And so that's what leads to what is probably the third and the real nail in the coffin at Kursk in 43, where his localized offensive to steady the line gets absolutely repulsed badly.
And it's at the Kursk, the numbers are just mind-boggling. On the number of tanks on the German side, over 3,000 tanks, I think. But outnumbered by the Soviets.
But again, that is Hitler not believing that the Soviets could produce so much equipment. They obviously had Allied Lend-Lease supplying them too. So by the end of the war, I think the Americans had supplied over 400,000 Studebaker trucks, for instance, to the Soviets. I mean, that makes all your armies motorized. I mean, the Red Army was a motorized army thanks to American mass-produced engineering, which doesn't really get discussed in Russia much nowadays. But so you've got that, and yeah, he just didn't believe that, like he had done the year before with Stalingrad. He just didn't believe that they, with the losses that he was seeing on paper, we're talking millions of troops either killed or captured by the Germans over the last 2 years. I mean, again, as I say in the book, the Red Army was rebuilt 5 whole times in the course of the Second World War. That's how much catastrophic losses they suffered in terms of dead and wounded. So Hitler on the other side, seeing a lot of this by 43, thinking, well, how can they keep They can't be just producing tank army after tank army after tank army, and that's exactly what they were doing. But equally, as you and I both know as well, that the Soviets were now armed with high-grade intelligence from the Allies, particularly at Bletchley Park, giving him a really good, accurate outline of what the Germans were up to in terms of strategically where they were moving their fresh formations to, what was likely going to be the next offensive, mini offensive on the Eastern Front in the summer of 43. They'd already successfully turned back the previous 2 years of offences. Now, what were they going to do? And that's what, that's the key thing. It's a refusal to believe reality from Adolf Hitler coming up against the reality of what the Soviets could now do once they'd spent a year and a half to 2 years learning the German way of blitzkrieg and then giving it back to the Germans themselves.
And so at the Kursk, this battle that it sort of rages for a month, doesn't it? And it's just, when you say it's the largest tank battle of the war, I mean, it's probably the largest tank battle ever, actually, isn't it?
Yes, it is. By some way. I mean, especially in the constricted area it was in. I mean, like I said, it's the salient. It was a salient that stuck into by about 50 to 60 kilometers into the German lines, which they had, obviously, they were now solidifying. This line still is over 1,500 kilometers long. It stretches from the edge of the Caucasus all the way up to Leningrad by the Baltic. It's a long line to defend, and sticking into this in the south by Kursk was this blot of land that obviously Hitler thought they could pinch off. It was a classic target for them to try what had worked before the year before, and in Barbarossa in 41, where you pinch off the flanks of the enemy, cut through them with armored formations, and then you bottle up the masses of troops and logistical equipment that are trapped in that area. And then you're going to reduce them by aerial bombardment, artillery bombardment, until you end up bagging 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 troops, which had happened before. It was what they thought Kursk would be.
And if they succeeded, then what would have that resulted in? How big a defeat would that have been for the Soviets? Because presumably I'm assuming they had limitless supplies of men to throw in.
Well, they did. Exactly, they did. It's hard to think what, other than stabilizing the line, and then in Hitler's mind, which by this time was obviously fueled by some fantasy, was what would they do again? What were they possibly going to try and repeat that had failed the year before when they tried to get into the Caucasus? They had way less men, way less equipment. They knew what kind of vast tracts of land was involved in trying to capture it. Hadn't worked before. How would it work again? I think he pretty much, because you've got to remember, which I hadn't talked about before, but I do in the book, is there was a price to pay from the German people about what had happened at the disaster of Stalingrad. The regime, it wasn't going to topple, but there'd been heavy criticism at home about the surprise the public had had about this defeat that was suddenly announced. The German state propaganda had kept a lid on the disaster that was going to happen at Stalingrad. So once the Sixth Army was surrounded, very little official news had been said about what was going on. And it was only right towards the end where, you've got German news outlets saying that the Sixth Army is surrounded, it's fighting heroically. But then you've got this almost like fantastical storyline that was invented by the Nazi leadership, and really someone like Goering really went to town in radio broadcasts about it, about these German troops that were getting destroyed at Stalingrad. It was like the Spartans at Thermopylae, and the German nation should be proud of these heroes because they're laying down their lives for the greater good of the Nazi regime, blah, blah, blah. But you've still got over 300,000 to 500,000 German families are thinking, where's my loved one gone? And that was the kind of reaction you were getting, that the regime was getting from the German nation. And equally, while all this is going on, the country's still being bombed from the air by the Allies, which is starting to really take effect now. So there's a lot of negativity. So I would imagine that the German army on the Eastern Front is not in a position to try and take Leningrad in the north. They're certainly not in a position to win strategic victories in the center, where you got, again, it's a different episode on the podcast, but you could talk about the situation on Rzhev, which is called the meat grinder. There's a great book by Prit Buttar about that. That involved millions of men as well. That's a huge area. And that's the thing, is Russia is just so monumentally huge. Just in the center, there was this enormous, gargantuan battle going on, and had been for about 18 months, of who's going to have strategic overview of there. And in the south, if you look at this little piece of land around Kursk that's sticking out, probably if you're thinking that's an easy win, and we can have a localized victory, we still might bag hundreds of thousands of POWs, and it might just be the shock the Soviets need that buys us even more time to solidify the line. I think that's what they were thinking of. I suppose as generals on the ground that were given the task of doing it, they believed to a degree that they probably would be able to have this local victory. They certainly had the equipment. So obviously they've still got their Panzer IIIs, but they've got their Panzer IVs. They've got the Tiger tanks coming online, the new Panther tank, which was going to be this kind of riposte to the T-34. That's coming online.
So you mentioned these tanks. I always get a bit interested in this. The Tiger tank I always thought was, but this is Tiger 1. It's not. We're not at Tiger 2 stage yet, are we?
It's not the King Tiger, no.
No. So I always thought it's the best tank of the war, but that's not quite right, is it? It is the
no, not at all. No, I'm
the Russian one, isn't it?
I mean, no, yeah, absolutely. In terms of design, ease of manufacture, as in how quickly you can manufacture that, which is why the Soviets succeeded. They could very simple design. They kept everything basic. All the finishes were basic. It wasn't like the Germans with this over-engineered behemoth, which is fantastic. And I love the Tiger and I love the Panther, but the T-34 was the tank of the Second World War. I mean, there's hands down. I mean, that's just the truth.
Not the Churchill.
And then I love the Churchill, but it's T-34 every time for me.
Yes.
But also, what we were just saying is, by Kursk, yes, the Germans had the Tiger 1, bigger tank, more armor, bigger gun, the 88, and the Panther 2 is the same. But equally, the Soviets had upgunned their T-34. And so by Kursk, you've got the T-34-85, which has an 85 millimeter gun. The previous mass-produced T-34 was a 76 millimeter gun, which is more than the match for the Panzer III and the Panzer IV. But the T-34-85, again, was a game changer. And they were mass producing those as well. The bulk of the Soviet army you see after Kursk that's heading west through Poland and into Germany, a lot of that is T-34-85 because it's just a very, very superior tank, scary tank, and it was easy to make. So again, that's what we're looking at here. That's what Hitler underestimated, was how quickly the Soviets could replace their staggering losses in men, but equally in terms of armor and in aircraft. By then, by Kursk, the Russian Air Force had almost been rebuilt. It was obviously full of green pilots to a large degree because the original Air Force had been destroyed in the first year of fighting. But by 43, it was in good shape, and they were bringing on lots of really, really good planes. Like, again, one of my favorites, and I'm not biased towards Russians, but the Sturmovik armored ground attack plane, amazing, and they caused havoc at Kursk.
Was it then the Soviet equipment that really made the difference? Because there's some great generals on the German side, aren't there? There's Guderian. Isn't Guderian flown out to help?
Yeah, and there's one Kleist. I mean, they've got the men. I mean, they think they've got the men, the fresh troops, and the armor to do the job, and they've got the Luftwaffe supporting them. These were guys that had already, yes, they'd had a disaster at Stalingrad, but these guys still remember that when it came to the summer campaigning, they'd always held the day. They'd always pushed forward, taken on the enemy, usual tactics, engage at the front, cut through the lines quickly, pour in the armored formations, cut them at the back, encircle them, destroy them or capture them. That had worked. It worked 2 summers in a row. They were expecting the same thing to happen in a more localized area, not on the grand front as it had been before, but they thought this will work again. They just weren't expecting the kind of forces that they would come up against, but equally they had no idea that the Soviets knew exactly what they were going to do. And that came from the intelligence that they gathered themselves, but also what the Allies were giving them too. They knew down to a T, what formations were up against them, what kind of tanks they were going to have, possibly how many troops they were going to be facing. And that led Zhukov to make sure that he planned in detail how he was going to structure his defensive works. And that's what, definitely Soviet generalship, German generalship was probably quite even by then, as was the performance of the troops. It's just a case of that the Germans weren't expecting the kind of defensive works that the Soviets put in place, primarily because they knew the Germans would attack them. They had time to plan.
This battle, which, as we know, is a great victory for the Soviets, that's it. After that, I mean, that's almost the last throw of the dice on the Eastern Front for the Germans, wasn't it?
Well, I was going to say in terms of offensive, yes, I think.
Because it goes on for another, I don't know when they hit German territory. Is it?
Well, it's about another 20 months.
44.
20 months. Yeah. I mean, it's another 20 months until they're in Berlin. So yeah, I mean, there was still a lot of fighting to do, and the Germans would conduct a decent withdrawal once they. Again, it's another episode, but then 44. That's when the Soviet sledgehammer really hits them across the whole front in the centre, and you got Operation Bagration, and that destroys German Army Group Centre. And that's the biggest catastrophe for the German and Axis armies on the Eastern Front, is then just purely from the numbers of men and material they lose in one fell swoop. And by then, 44 as well, the Soviet forces are even in a better position in terms of being motorized. That's what gets them to Berlin so quickly. But in 43, yeah, I mean, again, the Germans, as I said, they weren't expecting the defensive intricacy that Zhukov put up against them, belts of defensive works stretching for, 10, 20, 30 kilometers, millions of mines laid to draw the panzers or armored formations into lanes of killing zones that they could take them out. Tens of thousands of Soviet troops trained with anti-tank rifles and booby traps to take on the tanks that were right in front of them. I mean, the Germans' forces, you could argue, yes, they walked into a very sophisticated giant trap, but they still managed to bludgeon their way through from the north and from the south, because it was pincers coming from those directions. They still managed to bludgeon their way through. It just got blunted after, as you said, after 2 to 3 weeks of fighting. They're exhausted. They even though they believe they're winning, but it's really probably the toughest fighting German forces have had on the Eastern Front was at Kursk, in that very small area, and they just ground to a halt. They thought they could call it off on their terms, as in, we can't get any further, we're just going to have to rest and try and rebuild and solidify the lines again. Hitler and his commanders underestimated the fact that even though they've destroyed hundreds, if not thousands, of Soviet tanks, killed hundreds of thousands and captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, they can't stop the campaign on their own terms. And the Soviets hit them with their own counteroffensive that's even bigger than the troops that the Germans have been fighting against for the past month. And that's what did the damage too.
The Soviets had completely learned from the previous 2 summers that they knew what the way, the modus operandi of the German army was to attack like you described. So they didn't then build up this amazing defensive structure.
At Kursk, that's a very specific operation, defensive operation for the Soviets, that they deliberately did because they knew the Germans were going to attack there. And that's purely from the intelligence that they had at their disposal, which we helped with, obviously.
Bletchley Park really can't be underestimated how important it was at the Kursk.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, from a myriad of other sources too, by then, Stalin believed what he was being sent, because you've got to remember, I mean, Britain had been telling Stalin before Operation Barbarossa about German troop movements and what he could expect in terms of what the Germans were up to. They were going to launch an offensive against the Soviet Union in June 41, and he refused to believe it. Just said it's a concoction by Western states to try and destabilize my relationship with Hitler. So by 43, the summer of 43, 2 years later, he's been given top quality information about what they're now planning. And he knows these are the tools that I've got, that I can massively defeat them now. at a place of their choosing, but we can now know what's coming. He knew he could do it. And I was going to say, it gets back to your point just then, is the Red Army had 2 years of learning their lessons the hard way. So they'd been almost destroyed in Operation Barbarossa. They'd rebuilt. Then with the summer offensive that would end at Stalingrad, again, Stalin was taking control of a lot of the decision making at the beginning of that summer offensive. It was disastrous. They lost hundreds of thousands of men and equipment, which allowed the Germans free rein to plunge down into the Caucasus. It was only then that he realized, I've got to let my professional senior staff like Zhukov, Rosakovsky, they've got to be allowed to run this war for me. So that leads to where you are at Kursk, where he's allowing his general staff, the Stavka, to dictate how they're going to prosecute the war in the summer of 43. And look at what it delivers, a stunning, stunning victory.
Now, one thing we haven't really mentioned, and it's something that whilst we were both saying how wonderful General Manstein is, he was accused of plenty of war crimes. And so there were atrocities being committed throughout this period, weren't there, on the Eastern Front by the Axis side. Is this something that was constant throughout, even during the retreat after the Kursk and during the advance before Stalin?
Oh, yeah. On the Eastern Fronts, you've got the Reichenau Order, which had been given just before they jumped off for Operation Barbarossa in June 41. And that was basically telling German officers on the front that they had no moral obligation to adhere to the Geneva Convention in terms of prisoners of war, civilians, etc. This was going to be a lot of your listeners will know anyway, it's a fight to the finish. It was a war driven by doctrine and racial superiority. So
the Slavs are viewed as Untermenschen, aren't they?
Yeah. So it wasn't an obligation to be taking prisoners of war. Certainly wasn't an obligation to be taken prisoners of war with any kind of political officers that they might encounter. So the famous Commissar order, which was basically shoot them on the spot or get from them any information you can before killing them. And that continued throughout the war. One of the things, because we were talking at the top of this podcast about what I say to students and even audiences at festivals, it is hard. There's a very Western approach sometimes to think if you're telling the story of this army that's thousands of miles away from home on the Volga, surrounded by outnumbered by huge forces and slowly freezing and starving to death, it's a human reaction to feel sorry for them. And it's a human reaction which I found with a lot of my audience and students that I talk to want to know more about what the Germans were doing at Stalingrad rather than the Soviets. And a little bit of what's going on right now plays to that story too, as in who cares about what they were doing. But as I've said to a lot of them, is you've got to remember, the Sixth Army, yes, it was heroically, in some terms you could say heroically destroyed at Stalingrad, but it was still an army that had quite willingly helped logistically facilitate, for instance, the Holocaust. And a lot of the victims of the Holocaust were trucked to their final destination by trucks of the Wehrmacht, or were corralled or driven like cattle by Wehrmacht troops. And so Manstein's part of that. And quite rightly, again, something I talk about as well is there was a pell-mell rush at the end of the war for senior German commanders that had survived, like Manstein, to get their side of the story out while they could and while no one had told any kind of official story. Obviously, you had the Nuremberg, I know we're jumping ahead here, but obviously you had the Nuremberg trials in 45, and you had various Nazis that were tried and found guilty, and some were jailed for life, some were hung. But officers like Manstein, one of the first big autobiographical pieces of work that came from any German commander in West Germany, because that's where he lived, that's where he ended up, that were as a bestseller in the early 50s was Manstein. And that set the template for a lot of how we think the fighting on the Eastern Front was fought, is through his eyes. And as I said before, he was very much a politician too. So he knew how to tell a good tale that put him in the best light and put others, whether they were political or army adversaries or fall guys. So Paulus at Stalingrad is pretty much a fall guy. And the way we view Paulus in the West is primarily through the works of people like Manstein and how he managed to spin the story that gave him the best light possible, but kind of, I suppose, condemned Paulus as an incompetent commander. So there's that kind of thing. But yes, getting back to your thing, yeah, there was no quarter given on both sides.
But just on Manstein as well, I guess from that memoir, the whole myth of the Wehrmacht being, you know, they were the sort of the good bad guys, if you understand what I'm saying, and it was really only the SS that committed atrocities. That myth, which still in some quarters is prevalent, was, I suppose, begun by Manstein in his memoirs.
He's one of them. Right. He's one of them. I mean, if your listeners want to go and check out his book, it's called Lost Victories, and you can buy secondhand copies. I think you can even buy I think there are a few first editions on eBay as well, but I've got a copy of it. And so obviously it's completely interesting, but as a historian, you have to take a massive dose of salt with it and look at all the other works that are around it and other commanders that were there at the time too. It can't be denied. It's not just the SS. You can't commit that many atrocities on a vast military army that you're up against, but equally a vast civilian population. You can't do that just with the SS and kill millions upon millions of Soviet citizens and Soviet soldiers. That's got to be with the complete combined strength of whatever armies you have at your disposal. And the vast bulk of German forces on the Eastern Front were Wehrmacht.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the numbers. There's something like, is it around 10 million in the Eastern Front killed? Soviet losses across the war
German,
are more. On the Soviet side.
It's about 27 million altogether, 11 million killed in the Red Army itself. I think they drafted something like across the war. It's like I was saying to you before, they rebuilt the Red Army 5 times, which is what, blew Hitler's mind, I suppose, if he could see the statistics. But 34 million Soviets were drafted into the Red Army during the Second World War, which is just incredible. It's mind-boggling. And like I said, the Ukrainian element of that is roughly about 5 million, just over 5 million. And I think it's 1.7 million were killed. Yeah, it's just crazy numbers. I'm trying to think what else I can say to your listeners about the losses. I mean,
so civilians, I was reading something like, have we already mentioned that?
It's roughly about 16 million.
Right.
And they also lost on the European side of Russia. It's something like 78,000 villages, towns, and cities completely destroyed. I mean, that's the whole infrastructure of the country wrecked, which they're still, I would imagine, there are still areas there that still haven't been rebuilt. But again, it's when I'm talking about that to an audience, it's obviously very relevant in their mind's eye because they're looking at what's being destroyed in the Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. The people in Britain are often accused of being obsessed with the Second World War, but those numbers you've just given speak to why in the Great Patriotic War, as it's called in Russia, and some of the, I guess that speaks to why it's such a major event for them. They're probably
it's the event, and the thing is, again, I've talked about it in my book, and I talk about it when I'm giving talks. Putin is just like, I mean, obviously he is the bogeyman for now. He has been for years, in my eyes, anyway, and he's on his own trajectory of what's going to happen to him. But I think a Western audience has to realize just how strongly the vast bulk of Russians feel the way he does about the Second World War. They're obviously not homicidal maniacs like he is, but they do believe it. And I think I've said this to you before, Ollie, about I've still got quite a few friends in Russia that I'm in contact with. I was speaking to them a couple of weekends ago because obviously the May Day celebrations were coming up, and that they've still been sending me photographs and things like that they do on WhatsApp. But they might have their own opinions of Putin and also his regime, and they might be unhappy, like the vast bulk, I would imagine, of Russians are. But as they say to me, they just got to keep their head down and get through. But they all believe that the Second World War was won on the Eastern Front through their country or the Soviet republic's sacrifice. And when you look at the figures, it's hard not to argue that. I mean, it's, the German army on continental Europe was broken by Soviet forces. Can't be argued with. I mean, it's there for all to see.
Iain, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much. So the paperback, it's out already, actually, isn't it?
It's out on I think it's the 15th of June.
15th of June. Great. Now, we can do a giveaway.
Yep.
You said you had a few to give away. I can give away one to someone who signs up to a 5 copies being given away by Iain. And I have listeners in Samoa and Peru, but UK listeners.
I'll post them abroad. I don't mind.
You haven't checked how much that will cost.
I do. No, I do. It's about 20 quid a time.
Oh, you don't want to do that.
I don't mind. No, it's good. It's good to promote the podcast. You've been really good promoting me. So
I'll tell you what, we can chip in on that. Okay, well, let's do it. Let's do it then. So for listeners to the podcast, and this will be for our most loyal listeners, if you email me, I'll give you the email address. It's history@aspectsofhistory.com. We're giving away 5 copies of signed copies. Are they, Iain, are they paperback or hardback?
Paperback, but I'll sign and dedicate as requested.
5 copies of Iain's paperback, The Lighthouse of Stalingrad, to listeners. 5 individual listeners email me history@aspectsofhistory.com, and we will have a signed and dedicated copy of Iain's book sent to you. That isn't Iain just so generous, listeners. Iain, thank you. Thank you so much for that. It's been a wonderful, wonderful lesson on the Eastern Front, and particularly Kursk and then all the horrors of the fighting there. And so, Iain, what are you working on at the moment? I know you had another book that you were thinking.
Yeah. I'll be going to America towards the autumn to do research, followed by Japan. So that gives you a hint. Ooh. And it's on the last year of the war. Wonderful. I love the Eastern Front. I would love to do another book sometime soon, but it's just I was really lucky with the Stalingrad book to get access to the archives in Volgograd. But I mean, for any Western historian, it's going to be really hard to get into Russia over the next few years, I would expect. So that's the reason why that's been curtailed. But I'm really interested in certain elements of the Pacific War, so that's where my new book's going to be set.
Oh, wonderful stuff! I'm excited about that. Iain, thanks so much for coming on.
Cheers! Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. Please do rate and review, and do tell your friends. More to come, and don't forget those listeners who want to take up today's offer. The first 5 I receive will get the generous gift from Iain MacGregor. Until then, thank you and good night.